been in HUD grants. So I've done this stuff. I've done inspections. I've done rent calcs for HOPWA, the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS program, for ESG. I've been a member of a COC. So sort of I've been there, done that, seen it all. So with that said, why don't we start on today's topic? So the series of of all of these trainings is sort of to give some high level information on a number of topics that are relevant for all of you that are funded, but particularly more of you that had some issues, some concerns, either in past monitoring, in some of the TA kickoff calls that the collaborative applicant has funded for you all, right? Some of these questions came up. So today we're going to focus on inspections and particularly just a little bit on HQS and a high level overview of NSPIRE. So I do, if you all have a moment in the chat, if you could introduce yourself, just because I like that record, particularly who you are, where you're from, and then what you do for the COC program, particularly if you do inspections. I think one of the things that's always interesting about questions is I'm a firm believer there's no such thing as a bad question, but it's always helpful to know what you do, right? Because inspectors might ask very different questions than someone who just does some monitoring, someone who might look at the form. So all of that thrown into the chat would be great. Otherwise, the idea is we're going to look at the COC inspection requirements directly from the regulations, the old regulations and updated regulations, because that's going to be the difference between HQS and NSPIRE. I'll break that down so it's not just regulatory speak. This will also include a high-level overview of HQS, right? So sort of to frame it, because I'll also say I think more of you are more prepared for NSPIRE than you think you are. So I'll level set that by talking about what you already know. And then we'll go over a quick preview of NSPIRE. We'll talk about what we know. We'll talk about more what we don't know. And then I'll talk about some of the resources or materials that you all can review to learn more about it. So currently, if you were to look at the COC regulations at 24 CFR 578, the COC regulations have been updated to talk about NSPIRE, but there is currently not an implementation notice for NSPIRE. So this information on this slide and what we'll talk about is sort of a past date, what is currently in place, what HUD would currently monitor for. So currently what HUD would monitor for is going to talk about the housing quality standards HQS inspections. And it says housing leased with COC funds or for which rental assistance payments are made with COC funds must meet the applicable housing quality standards under 24 CFR 982.40. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But it also then notes that part of that regulation, 401J, applies to only housing occupied by program participants receiving TBRA. I'll break that down. I won't go into too much in that middle column about lead-based paint, except for the COC regulations talk about lead-based paint. We'll break that down in the next slide because it's not going to change. But that more important piece is that last column, the compliance and documentation. So CUC regulations say the recipient or subrecipient must retain documentation of compliance with the housing standards, HQS, including inspection reports. So this is where the first time in all the TA that we're going to talk about over all of these training sessions for those communities working with us, right? We're going to talk about document, document, document. Because if the documentation does not exist, then it did not happen. Just because you know you did the inspection and you know it passed, if it's not in the file, when you win the lottery and leave your organization and someone else steps in, no one can guess what happened. So the goal of documentation is always that you control the narrative now and in the future. So particularly for inspections, making sure there's documentation. So to get away from the regulatory speak, right, once again, COC is saying that all funds paid with leasing or rental assistance funds must meet these requirements before expending funds. It's also worth noting that units must additionally meet all applicable state and local housing codes. So particularly if there's a more restrictive ordinance, you would need to follow that. So the example that I always use is living in Maine, and I serve the entire state of Maine for some of my programs. So Portland, Maine, our largest city, had a more restrictive ordinance around smoke alarms. So while I was doing HQS, I would do 99% of my inspection HQS. I would have to note a more restrictive smoke alarm requirement because the city of Portland required it just for the city of Portland units. So I always note like there's always a little nuance that you should always be aware of. So lead-based paint screening, once again, this is the same. It will not change even with NSPIRE implementation, but you all are probably aware that the cross regulations at Part 35, which is what implements lead-based paint, says that in these units, you must do a lead-based paint visual assessment. The hyperlink, and you all will get not just this recording, but the slide deck. The hyperlink takes you to the HUD visual assessment training course. I hope you have taken this. I'm sure you have taken this, particularly if you're doing inspections or you're monitoring inspections. It's about an hour long, but it's important because it frames what you must do. And particularly during the COVID lockdown days, there was a lot of confusion. And so sometimes I'm not sure people understand what a visual assessment is because you're not pulling lead paint chips, right, or paint chips and putting them in a baggy CSI style and mailing them off, right? You're just going in a unit and looking around because that's the first step of these bigger regulations. So make sure you know that course, take the course, print out the certificate to document that you've taken it. And once again, it will reference it in the slide deck, but none of that is going to change. It will stay the same. And for that compliance or documentation, once again, making sure you have something in the file. Most likely you all are using the HQS long form or short form. We'll talk about that in a little more specificity here in a little bit. But what's important is not just that that's in the file, but it is clearly and entirely filled out. Because not only is the vast majority of that checklist talking about meeting HQS inspections, but it's also where you demonstrate the date of the inspection so HUD knows when it occurred. It will outline when a next inspection must occur to make sure this is happening annually. It's going to outline if it meets target housing, which I'll come back to in just a second, right? Because that's stuff at the top is going to ask about the family size. It's going to ask about children under the age of 6 and when the unit was constructed. So that checklist sort of pulls everything together, if entirely filled out, that tells the story about what you need to do. So all that to be said, to sort of pull all of these last pieces together. So a lead-based paint visual assessment, documentation if it needs to occur, only happens if the unit meets the definition of target housing. And this comes from Part 35, the lead-based paint requirements. So it's not the COC program defining it, it's not HUD defining it, it's the EPA defining it. So the current definition of target housing is any unit built before 1978 where a child under the age of 6 resides or is expected to reside. I highlight that because this definition changed in 2022. So some programs think that there's exemptions to this rule based upon if it's elderly or disabled or the size of the housing, and all those exemptions are out. It has been updated, and when you all get these slides, there's a note in there that will show you where, right? Sort of that backup documentation. So it's no longer about senior elderly housing. It's no longer about if it's a 0 bedroom, right? Any unit built before 1978 where a child under the age of 6 resides or is expected to reside must have a lead-based paint visual assessment before assistance begins and at least annually. So to meet this HQS compliance piece, clearly you all are going to do an initial inspection before any assistance begins, right? Because you need to have sort of an understanding of what does this unit look like if it's going to pass inspection? What are the pieces that may not pass inspection? Not what needs to be repaired, right? So making sure that's happening. The bigger piece of that is sort of that corrective time frame. So if a unit does not pass inspection, right, landlords have 30 days to make those corrections for assistance to continue. The big piece of this that sometimes programs forget about or don't implement correctly, if the inspection problem, if that HQS piece is not corrected within 30 days, you cannot pay rent, right? And you must abate rent. And that means that you also cannot go back and pay rent if that is corrected in the future, right? So once it's out of compliance, it remains out of compliance until fixed, and you cannot go back and backdate that or back pay that. So it's an issue that a lot of programs wrestle with now. And I say that now because it will become a much bigger deal with NSPIRE. So this is one of the pieces here in a moment when we start talking about NSPIRE. I'm going to start talking about making sure what you do now is correct, because that's really the foundation. The house itself is going to look a little different with NSPIRE, but the foundation, the basement, isn't going to change. So making sure what you do now is correct so that NSPIRE implementation is a little easier. You all need to make sure you're doing an annual inspection. Some HUD programs don't require an annual inspection, particularly some of the PIH programs like HCV or Section 8. That does not apply to COC, so it doesn't matter if the unit's perfect, right? You have to go back every year. You can't punt and do every 2 or 3 years. It must happen annually. And then that last piece, I won't go into detail, but just the flag, because once again, organization by organization, this may or may not be relevant, but the COC regulations, which is called the interim rule, talks about a conflict of interest. So making sure that if you own the property for which the leasing or rental assistance funds will be used, you're not doing the inspection. HUD would consider that a conflict of interest. So for some of you doing community-based, right, or using leasing funds to lease properties that aren't yours, you don't have to worry about this. But I always like to throw that into any presentation. So if there are particular situations, scenarios, questions tied to conflict of interest, it's been cited and you all can ask those when appropriate or when you feel comfortable to. So just real quick on HQS, because once again, I feel from these trainings that I've done across a bunch of HUD programs is you all have a much better sense of NSPIRE even before NSPIRE comes out. Because it's similar to HQS in that HQS just lays out the minimum property standards as approved by HUD. So HQS has a list of performance requirements and acceptability criteria. The next slide, I'll demonstrate that and how it all plays out operationally. But so that all plays out in those forms, the HUD form, the 52580, the short form, or the 52580A, the long form. So what is rooted in regs and how that plays out is shortened to a checklist. But once again, you all frankly know it because HQS for all of the pages of inspections really come down to 13 core standards. And so those are in the regs. We won't go over them, but sort of to show the checklists themselves are just the operational endpoint of what you already know and are comfortable with. So here's that demonstration as we wrap up this HQS piece. So that top screenshot shows the regulations. So once again, there's 13 standards. Each of those standards has a performance requirement and acceptability criteria. The NSPIRE materials, if you've already looked at them or will look at them, are laid out frankly pretty similar. It's going to have this performance requirement. It's going to talk about why it's important, and then an acceptability criteria, how you actually inspect. So those performance and acceptability criteria play out in the checklist. So these are screenshots from the long form. So you all, if you've seen this form, use this form, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But so the checklist goes into more details. And so that's what you all get trained on. That's what you know about, but that's not what's in regs. It's just what's operationally been added to the checklist. And then that gets further simplified into the actual checklist itself that you all use. So once again, the foundation of what you know for HQS is pretty strong. You just use a checklist to sort of operationalize your knowledge. So we're doing strengths-based today, everyone, right? You know HQS well, even if you aren't using the checklist all the time, because the foundational knowledge is necessary to use that checklist. And that's what you need to know going into Inspire. So with that change, right? One of the things that we will talk about just sort of quick before we go into how COC will talk about Inspire is just a quick sort of overview of Inspire to make sure we're all on the same page. So the idea of Inspire is it's prioritizing core quality, right? So in theory, Inspire is moving away from visual deficiencies or problems to more actual health and safety issues. So HQS has a lot of what does something look like? And so there are some fails that are purely based upon appearance. Inspire throws all of that out. Something cannot look pretty, but as long as it functions, it's okay. The idea of Inspire and why it's coming out is to create a more single standard across all HUD programs. And in a moment, I'll show you what some of those programs are. But while it might be a little rocky rolling out across programs, eventually it will make it easier for programs, it will make it easier for landlords, it will make it easier for families. Because while there is some variability across programs, the core, sort of the basis of it all, will remain the same. The big piece too about Inspire is it's really going to shift to you spending more time inspecting where the family actually lives, their private space. Inspire shifts away. While you will do some of the more common areas that's not entirely out, you'll spend a lot more time where families spend most of their time. That's what Inspire wants. We want to make sure where their private space, where they're spending most of their time is the safest. And Inspire also is the goal to make it more objective. While HQS does have some questions, HUD realized over the years that that is wildly interpreted across programs or even within programs, and sometimes even within communities. One HQS inspector might wildly interpret something from a different HQS inspector, even if they're funded by the same funding source or work for the same organization. So Inspire's goal is to make things more objective, not just within a community, but across the country. So Inspire will replace or has replaced all the other inspection methodologies that exist. Habitability for some of our friends for HOPWA and ESG, HQS for COC, HCV, those programs, and then UPCS, which is what your public housing programs will use. So all of these will eventually go away and fall under Inspire. So there's a lot of programs that have to know about Inspire or will have to know about Inspire. And so this list comes straight from the regulations. So you'll basically see almost every HUD program will fall under this. And I'll also note there's a number of programs outside of this list that will also fall under because their regulations will be updated. So once again, this is a big deal, which is one reason Inspire implementation has been a slow rollout to make sure that if we change one piece of the puzzle, the rest of the puzzle doesn't fall apart. I'll also note that as of today, August 13th, 2026, there is only one program that is required to use Inspire, the HOPWA program, the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS. Its implementation notice went out last August. There's a hyperlink there in case you want an example of what an implementation notice looks like. All other programs, it's currently optional, and the implementation dates are different. So the only other implementation notice that went out were for different programs, home and HTF. Its implementation date, it will definitely be April 14th because it has this implementation notice. For other programs, including the COC, it's currently slotted to be October 1st, 2026. But as of today, there is no implementation notice, right? So there's not the nitty-gritty details. Every time I do this training, folks have really great questions, and I'll say, I don't know the answer to that, right? Until there's an implementation notice, until HUD tells us what they want and gives us specific instructions on how to meet that, it's all a guess. So let's sort of get a sense, right? Because I don't want to talk about Inspire and leave it purely to sort of be this mysterious creature that's sort of looming in the distance. So once again, the regulations for the Continuum of Care program have already been updated, even if not implemented. So you could look at COC regs today, and you already have a sense of what Inspire is going to look like for the Continuum of Care. So the first is what's going to require the inspection did not change. So housing lease or assisted with COC funds, uh, including rental assistance, must meet, and it's now been updated to Inspire regulations, which are 5.703, except for it says the carbon monoxide detections do not apply. That's an important note. It's going to be one thing that's clearly going to be different for Continuum of Care Inspire versus other Inspire. The COC updated regs also talk about exemptions, in that if you were to look through the Inspire regs at 5.703 through 713, once again, Inspire applies to a whole bunch of programs. So 705 through 713 don't apply. What I'll highlight for you all, if you have sort of learned about this or are thinking about learning about this is where programs sometimes get in trouble. They'll think Inspire means that you can inspect a unit and then you have to put a score on that. That score will result in a 2 or 3 year time period for when you inspect. That will never apply to COC. Once again, you will continue to do annual inspections. The regs talk a little bit about the scope of applications. So particularly, this is one place that the implementation notice is going to be important because it says for TBRA and individual unit leasing, the standards apply only to the unit itself and to the means of egress from the unit and public way and common areas. That is something that's different for Inspire for COC regulations that other programs haven't talked about. So I've done this presentation and folks ask questions about that. And I'll say, I don't, your guess is as good as mine until HUD tells us an implementation notice. But otherwise, the documentation requirements also did not change, right? So you're going to have to prove when you did an inspection, did it meet all the requirements and all of the follow-up? And that documentation should exist to make sure you're meeting the compliance pieces for any future audit or monitoring. When we break that down, what we're also aware of, once again, we don't know the Inspire standards that will apply to the COC program, because once again, each program office has a little bit of flexibility, but your units will also have to meet any state or local codes or more restrictive ordinances, so that won't go. Lead-based paint did not change at all, including the definition of target housing. All of that remains. So what that means is Inspire, you're just going to use a different inspection methodology. That's it. And it will be a learning curve, right? Don't get me wrong. As someone who's taken the courses and learned, but the fundamentals, the foundation, the framing is all of the same as HQS. It's just how it might be documented or how you're documenting compliance might look a little different. So once again, the initial inspection needs to occur. That didn't change. There's a 30-day corrective window. That didn't change. But for all of the programs that have Inspire implementation notices, there's a lot more to be said about abatement. right? So once again, that's why I highlight it now. So you're sort of aware and can think through what that means before NSPIRE comes out, particularly if the COC implementation notice talks about it more. Otherwise, the annual inspection is still going to apply. Once again, it's not a 2 or 3 year, it's annually, and the conflict of interest didn't change. So if you do have a conflict of interest for inspections because it's a property that you own, right, that will also not change. So the framework, the structures, the systems that you're creating to meet compliance aren't going to change, just some of the specifics behind it. So let's sort of talk about what we do know for NSPIRE and for the Continuum of Care program, which is all on this slide, right? So there's not much known. So as of today, the current implementation date is suspected to be October 1st, 2026, right? Without an implementation notice, doing that's going to be very difficult because there's no, once again, no explicit instructions about how to meet this. But until we see a delay notice, also, we don't know. We reviewed the changes to the regulations. There's also a hyperlink here to a Federal Register notice that talks about the changes of regulations across all HUD programs. So if you're a regs nerd like myself and you want to know what's happening across all the HUD programs, that middle hyperlink will take you there. And then finally, the delay notice that pushed NSPIRE back to October 1st, 2026 said, here's some instructions for how to prepare for NSPIRE in the COC program. I have taken a screenshot of that to show you once again, there's not much information for us to go off of. So first is programs you can choose to implement NSPIRE early. HUD can't stop you because the regulations have already been updated. But it also makes it clear that you do not have to. You can continue to use HQS until October 1st, 2026, or that's extended, or there's an implementation notice with a more specific date. Right, so we're sort of all stuck in this limbo. But the big piece here, highlighted in that hyperlink, the 88 FR 40832, is it says that if you're going to implement NSPIRE, you have to follow what's there. So if you were to click on that hyperlink, it goes through all of the NSPIRE standards, and there's not a lot of applicability. It doesn't tell you how to inspect. It just sort of roughly goes over the ideas. So the issue is there's still no real implementation guidance. So that's noted because if an implementation notice comes out, and what I'll say is we weren't doing things according to what HUD wanted. You're going to have to make yet another change. So me as a TA provider, I also can't tell you what to do, but I will tell you there's no harm in continuing to do HQS until you are sure about what you have to do. So you don't continually change your program, continually change your program forms, put landlords through the ringer, put families through the ringer to just constantly have to keep changing it. So if you're not sure or uncomfortable, stick with what you're doing until HUD says you absolutely cannot. That way, whatever you change is a clear change and you know it's the right change. But I will say is this keeps reiterating that if you choose to implement NSPIRE early, you must put that date in your program records because HUD will hold you accountable to that date. So at some point, HUD will start monitoring for compliance for NSPIRE. And so if that implementation date is October 1st, right, and you weren't doing NSPIRE before then, you're good. But if you said you started at NSPIRE January 1, 2026, HUD's going to look for those forms. They're going to make sure you were doing it a certain way. So make sure a date is in your records. And what I've recommended to folks is that if you're not doing NSPIRE early, add that to your policies and procedures as well, right? So particularly any section on inspections, just a quick note about NSPIRE and saying we are not implementing this until an implementation date. So if HUD were to come to monitor, once again, you're controlling the narrative. It's very clear you understand and you're outlining what you're going to do. Again, you don't have to, but to control that narrative and to have a sense, it might be helpful. That is everything that is known, including by myself, right, for NSPIRE and the Continuum of Care program. There is not a lot. Everything else is just guesses, hunches, crystal balls, which particularly in this moment with all the NSPIRE implementation delays and some of that are just that, guesses. So what we'll end today with, right, is once again, I don't want to just leave you all with this sense of NSPIRE is looming. I now roughly have a super vague sense of what that is, but there is some prep that you can do. You can learn about NSPIRE so what that when an implementation notice comes out, right, you already have the terminology, you already understand it, and so you're just plugging in the specifics to the framework and the terminology you already understand. So NSPIRE, one of the big shifts is that it's going to outline parts of inspection as the inside, outside, and unit. So currently for HQS, you all are all used to doing inspections by rooms, right? That HQS checklist talks about kitchen, bathroom, sleeping room, other room. NSPIRE shifts that to an inside, outside, and unit. So there's still going to be standards. Those standards will still have performance requirements. There's certain things you need to look at to make sure it meets those performance requirements, but it's the documentation of that or how you might think about your inspections will shift from room to room to inside, outside, and unit. NSPIRE regulations, so meaning this will be cross-cutting across all of the programs, also outline what are called affirmative requirements. And affirmative requirements are items that all units must meet. So there'll be uniform inspection sort of deficiencies or issues that all HUD programs are going to have to use. And so those are operationalized through NSPIRE standards. So if you've looked at the HCV NSPIRE standards, if you've looked through the HOPWA NSPIRE standards, if you've gotten really curious and looked at the Homer HTF NSPIRE standards, that's how all of these sort of get operationalized. It's sort of the nitty gritty of how you inspect. But until we have COC NSPIRE standards, we can't be sure if everything's going to apply or if everything will be exactly the same besides affirmative requirements. So I'm going to just highlight these slides and you all can review them on your own, write homework, some fun time, learn them, quiz each other over your lunch breaks to make sure you understand them. But the terminology, the definitions will also be uniform. And once again, particularly through technical assistance, I think one of the biggest errors is programs define something locally differently than the federal government. And the federal government is looking at things through their definitions, not through our local definition. So understanding what affirmative requirement is and how HUD defines that. Understanding how HUD defines unit inside and outside, not what we feel it is or what we think it is, how HUD defines that, because that is in the regulations. So those are things you can look up now and start to get a sense of what an inspection will look like based upon unit inside and outside. The terminology for a deficiency, that terminology will be important because all the implementation notices keep talking about deficiency. So once again, so you can review this in the notes on your own, but that's really the like what you're looking for. Each deficiency also has certain categories for the severity of that, and each severity comes with a prescribed time frame for corrections. So for example, something that HUD might call life-threatening, which is the most jeopardy to a family's health and safety, generally has a 24-hour requirement to fix. Once again, until COC puts out their standards, we can't be sure, but generally across the other programs, what they have, but these four categories that all deficiencies are tied to, those definitions will also be the same. So some things that you can do now, right, to think about NSPIRE preparation. Once again, there's no shame in maintaining the status quo. Keep doing what you're doing to make sure you are doing what you should be doing correctly. Across the programs that I've seen implement Inspire, whether because they are required or they choose to, the biggest issues are really rooted in not doing HQS correctly in the first place. And if you don't know what you should be doing today, then making these changes become way more problematic because it highlights what was already happening and should not have been happening. So you can maintain the status quo as part of your Inspire preparation because that gives you some time to read and do some research without worrying about operationalizing it. Make sure what you are doing today, if HQS is correct and that you are documenting it correctly and your policies and procedures all reflect that. Because one of the big pieces for Inspire is that you're going to have to change your policies and procedures. And so if you don't have them now, that will be a bigger lift. Check your documentation, right? Make sure that's in the file, make sure it's properly filled out, make sure it tells the story that you want it to tell, because that will be huge for Inspire. So what I was saying is to think about your program design, think about who's currently doing your inspections. Are they really good and thoughtful and really understand HQS? If they don't like inspections, if they don't really understand HQS and they're not into the nitty-gritty details, Inspire will be painful for them. So think about shifting some responsibilities. I know we're sort of in the middle of a chaotic situation with funding, but I also would encourage you all to think about budgets. So your inspections will likely take longer when Inspire comes out, particularly at first. So to make sure there's enough budget across your leasing and rental assistance budgets to give staff a little more time to do inspections. Most of the implementation notices have also said that you can charge training time to those budgets. Once again, I don't want to tell you yet that's going to happen for COC, but it's been uniform. So to make sure there's some wiggle room across your budgets, because if budgets are tight, that's going to make Inspire implementation even more difficult. And then finally, make sure you sign up for updates directly from HUD, both the HUD.gov listserv and the HUD Exchange listserv. Previously, if something went out on one, it went out on both, and that hasn't always been happening. So I recommend programs sign up for both. So if there is an update, if there is a delay or an implementation notice, it will go out on at least one of those, if not both. So to have that available so you have the most recent information. Otherwise, here's the resources, right? So the regulations, some of the regulations for how this got implemented, that sort of tells the story. The extension of the Inspire compliance date, important for why you may or may not be doing things. These slide decks include some of the current implementation notices. So if you click on one, the implementation notice or the standards that went with them are hundreds of pages long. So once again, to really do this, we need very explicit instructions from HUD. But otherwise, the HCV Inspire standards are online. They're very easy to read. So if you just want to get a sense of how they're set up, you can do that. There's a template guide, right, that sort of explains why HUD set it up that way. If you're sort of the nerd like me and want to know what the terminology means, there's instructions on how to read the Inspire standards, so you sure you're reading them as HUD interprets them. I will say that currently there is no requirement that anyone doing an Inspire must be certified or must go through an training. It is proving to be helpful, but there are some free online resources or online inspector training. So this one, it's HUD that put it together. So once again, it's not super long, but once again, it sort of gives inspectors a sense of what's coming. There are some really great videos, though, that go into some really specific Inspire standards. And I love these because they're sort of showing what an inspection will look like for smoke alarms, for lead-based paint, for toilets and sinks, right? And those particular videos are about 3 minutes long. So they're easy, they're bite-sized, right? They're things that you can review, but it will give your inspectors a sense of what's the same and what's different. One thing that I'll note is that there is likely not to be an Inspire checklist from HUD because the program, like there's a HQS checklist because the HCV, your public housing, must use it. the housing authorities are going to have to use an online resource for NSPIRE because it will automatically be uploaded to PIH programs. So there may not be a HUD approved checklist for NSPIRE that ever comes out, but there is a TA created HCV NSPIRE checklist that you can look at that will sort of give you a sense of what any checklist might look like. And then there's some additional information there, the inspection protocol and guidance annexes. It's really in the weeds if you really want to get in the weeds for NSPIRE. But so these are all HUD approved resources. So once again, if you really want to know or you're really anxious about NSPIRE and you want to make sure you understand the foundation, the terminology, and how this is playing out in different programs, you have everything on one clean slide deck and not worrying about scraping the internet for what's correct or accurate. Before we stop recording for any Q&A, are there any Q&A or points that you would like to ask as part of the recording? All right, if not, as part of the recording, once again, thank you all for your time. I know it's a lot of information and we went through it quickly, but if you have follow-up questions, reach out to your collaborative applicant, or for those of you connected with a technical assistance provider, connect with that TA provider, and we're more than happy to do some more one-on-one agency TA on this topic or any of the topics COC related or in any of the future presentations.